I mix what I like.
For me, I just want to say it's an extreme pleasure to be on with you, Queen Mother Braid.
Okay.
You know, we get to meet you in person.
Leave the mother out, please.
You are flyer
Leave
in
the
person.
mother out.
Y'all got to see how she comes in the studio.
That's true.
Dressed to the
thank you,
10.
That's right.
Right? And I graduated out of Howard University School of Education, so I'm glad you were helping raise some funds there, too.
I fell in love with that whole school.
That's because I was there.
That's because you were there. I'm telling you.
This is what we do.
That's what you do.
But you know, it's important now to have intergenerational conversations, because usually the younger groups and generations are talking with older folks about what the older folks don't understand from younger folks, and older folks are saying younger folks just don't understand how things were and how we do. And so this is one of those needed moments of intergenerational conversation, because the issues that affect us as a people don't just affect one segment of the population. They affect from young to old. So this is extremely important. We thank you and your listeners for welcoming us and embracing us, and putting the Andrea Embray in the embracing, right?
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So we have with us a political science, speaking of Howard University, a doctoral student at Howard University's political science program, Araba Evelyn Johnston-Arthur. And she will be talking about her work with community grassroots organizations named Pomoja out of Austria, and the Africans in Austria, those African Austrians and African Germans. And we got to make sure that people understand that black folks exist outside the U.S. and these experiences that we have within the U.S. are happening all around the globe. So she will talk to us about those experiences in Austria. And for those of you that are jazz fans, you will note we're not just going to be talking about my favorite things and Coltrane talking about his classic My Favorite Things. That comes out of, what's the name of that movie?
We Can't Read Your Mind.
Sound of Music. That's right.
That's right.
And so we're talking about police repression in Nazi Germany and Austria. Well, that repression still exists in Austria, so we can't forget about that. And Dr. Ball, who else we got in here?
So we also have joining us by phone, we have Kevin Cobham, who is Cambridge University trained, King's College trained legal, lawyer, barrister, I believe they say over on that side of the world, and who comes from an African background. His parents come from Barbados and Jamaica. He's a criminal defense trial lawyer and very much a movement lawyer. He sees Pan-Africanism as a key to unlocking the anti-systemic consciousness that needs to occur to make some things happen. A brilliant brother that I had the chance to catch up with online. We're very happy to have him join us this afternoon. And we're also joined by folks that by a brother who is not at all a stranger to the airwaves here and to anybody who's involved with any form of political activism. We have brother Eugene Puryear from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, also running for D.C. City Council, one of the leading spokespeople on many issues affecting us around around the city and around the world. So we're happy to have all of them, and we can welcome them all to the show right now.
Okay, we want to people on the phone.
Yeah. So that's what we So anyway, welcome everybody to the program. Thank you for bearing with us, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Is that Dr. Jared?
That's me. Welcome, brother. How you doing, man?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be on the show and delighted to participate here from London.
We're happy to have you, and Sister Araba, welcome again to you as well.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And Brother Eugene, we believe you're there as well.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. So, we wanted to we wanted to start a conversation on this segment as we look at this issue of police violence here and around the world. We sort of subtitled this segment, "The Imperial Design of Policing Here and Abroad." And I thought maybe we would start with you, Sister Araba, and we could get you to talk a little bit about the organization that you represent, that you've been involved with, and some of the work you've been involved with in Austria and also throughout the Pan-African world. I know you're highly engaged with our folks wherever we are. So this issue of police violence, we started this conversation with Ferguson, Missouri, and Michael Brown. How does this issue look from your perspective, from an African Austrian perspective, so to speak?
What is very outstanding is, and I think the title of this talk, I mean, the imperial methods about policing are very much reflected throughout the African diaspora. So if we look at the patterns of violence that black people are confronted with, then you find a lot of similarities. You find similarities between patterns of violence within Austria that are also connected to patterns of violence that are now being seen and reflected in Ferguson. So this is something that's quite outstanding, that there is a lot of connections, there is a lot of patterns, and I think it is very important for us to know about more about the different struggles within the African diaspora, in order to be able to bring the different pieces together and also connect our local struggles to a global struggle against imperialism and exploitation. Right now, as we're talking, there is a warning, an EU-wide police operation against refugees that's called Mos Marianum, which is taking place from the 13th to the 26th of October. During those 2 weeks, there's about 18,000 police forces that are to chase people without papers within Europe. Now, the fortress of Europe is surrounded by a mass grave that is created through the militarization of the borders, and it's now 1 year ago that a boat of 500 refugees, mostly refugees from Africa, drowned, and it was about 400 people that drowned. It was women and babies included as well. And the response is a further militarization of the border. At the same time, Europe, as we're talking now, is also a place of resistance of refugees that are survivors and made it through those militarized borders, survived, and are staging protests within Europe, in Berlin specifically, but also in places like Austria. So there is, and I think that's something that's reflected within our experience. Wherever there's oppression, there's also resistance, and at the same time, this resistance is specifically targeted by the police state. So they also, if you look at the mechanisms, how our resistance is actually being broken down, you can see a lot of similarities. So talking from the perspective of Pamoja, in 1999, there was a big uprising in the black community against police violence, and the patterns are very much the same. It were very often young black people who are portrayed as overly aggressive, this is in their nature, who died under police custody. And then when the community came out in protest, the protest itself was criminalized as part of a criminal organization. Then you also have the element of anonymous witnesses testifying. So you have the creation of distrust within the community. And one thing that was successfully created was the co-optation of the protest. So what came out is a project called Africans and the Police. So now it is possible to belittle this violence as an intercultural misunderstanding between Africans and the police. And too often we do buy into it. So that's why I think it's very important, and I think the title of this discussion, naming it Imperial Policing, forces us to see the connections. We cannot understand the fortress of Europe if we do not connect this violence, this violence, with the reality of neocolonialization. It is directly connected. So our local struggles have to be global struggles. And so I think I'll leave it here for now.
First of all, thank you for that. And I think that's a hell of an image that you paint there. This description rather of Europe as a fortress surrounded by a graveyard of bodies from the world's majority. I mean, that's deep. That's pretty deep. Well, let's keep going. Let's keep going. By the way, folks, this is WPFW 89.3 FM. This is the Andrea Bray Show. She has been kind enough to share some of her time so we can continue this conversation we're having all day long, putting into proper context and globalizing, expanding the discussion around Ferguson and Mike Brown's killing, the killings of Oscar Grant and Eric Gardner and Renisha McBride, and the list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer and longer. So we want folks to continue to show their support for this wonderful program and this station. We want to thank Karina Frasrand out in Kensington, Maryland, for your pledge, and we want many more people to join her at 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739, or make that pledge of support at wpfw.org. We are, that is myself, Dr. Burrows, and Dr. Haight. We are the iMiXWHATiLiKE crew, the Killer Bees Squad. You can normally hear us Friday mornings at 10 a.m. right here at WPFW. But again, we're part of this collective collaboration taking place all day long here at WPFW 89.3 FM. So, Brother Cobham, if we could bring you into the conversation, please join us and talk to us a little bit about your work. I mean, granted, I came into contact with your work talking about some of the myths around the economic condition of African people around the globe and the general relationship we have to the state. Tell us a little bit about your perspective of these things and what you see coming out of London, England, and part of the broader diaspora, and more specifically your work as a people's attorney, which we need many more of.
Firstly, I come into it from a perspective of being an African, and I'm an African of African parents from Barbados and Jamaica. My mother, my father. I was born in London. And so I very much take on board a decolonial understanding of the way in which white supremacy and the agents of white supremacy, whether that be the police, whether it be the border agencies, deal with the violence imposed upon not just imposed upon us in a class sense, but on black bodies, and also limit the spaces in which we have to exercise our humanity. So it's from that perspective that I operate as a criminal defense lawyer, but also in terms of understanding my place and my space to exercise my humanity in the context of the global African community. I'm very much in agreement with our sister from Austria who just spoke. Europe is very much a fortress Europe. Not only do we have Africans dying in the boatload in the Mediterranean, trying to escape economically imposed oppression in the African continent, we also have this coordination which our sister referred to, this coordination of the security states within the EU to deal with the surveillance of African populations, the deportation of African populations, and also the subversion of any attempts to create. Can you still hear me? Hello.
We hear you fine. We hear you just
okay.
Fine.
There's also an attempt which our sister from Austria alluded to, attempts by various states to subvert genuine, self-determining organizations from below amongst African organizations, amongst African peoples, amongst African communities, and that subversion has an impact in terms of limiting our perceptions as to our global connections, and very often we fighting amongst working amongst grassroots organizations have to deal in a process of education which involves working locally, but thinking globally, and trying to make a connection between Ferguson, you may have heard of the killing of Mark Duggan in August 2011, which led to urban uprisings across England, in London, in Manchester, and other conurbations. Very often the problems we have in the UK are trying to raise a consciousness which goes beyond simply the local, and which connects us to our brothers and sisters in other parts of Europe, and indeed to the wider African diaspora. And if I could add, Dr. Jared, what when I first came across your work was a few years ago when you were in your book, which was relating to the Mixtape Manifesto, and the concept of the internally colonized. This is a concept which really, I think, those of us engaged in trying to understand why extrajudicial killings occur, why we have a fortress Europe, why black bodies in the public space are targeted. We can't understand it without understanding our position as the internally colonized wherever we are in the diaspora, and linking it into the imperial of our impression, and therefore connecting it also to anti-colonial struggles not only in Europe but also in the wider diaspora, including Africa. If one looks at the Maracana massacre in August of 2012, understand that in the same way that one can understand Ferguson, the dehumanization of Africans, the dehumanization of us in terms of our worth, our value, our human possibilities. That in extremis, even though we're talking about a situation where ostensibly we have a black majority-led government, an ANC government, which is essentially a neo-colonialist government. That's just one example of the way in which we can make connections between the legal and practical struggles we face in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere, and also the colonial struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, which we are all engaged with internationally.
All right. Thank you very much. That's Kevin Cobham, for those who just might be joining us here at the WPFW 89.3 FM. This is the Andrea Bray Show. Don't be confused. Don't be concerned. She has joined us in support for this special day of programming here at WPFW to cover more than what is often covered in this conversations that we see coming out of another police killing of a young brother in Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown. Just giving us some context from as he sees it as a people's lawyer there in London, England. And of course, he mentioned the Maracana mine massacre in what is supposed to be the post-apartheid new South Africa, looking very much like the old one. Welcome. Let me bring in our brother Eugene Puryear to the shoa, someone who I think might have one or two things he could say on this issue, particularly as it relates to the imperial design of the West. Joining us from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Welcome, Brother Puryear, back to the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, man. Always great to be on with you. So
you've heard what has been said so far. Tell us how you approach this in your work right here in D.C., this issue of police violence in particular, but also this issue of the relationship that black people and so-called minorities have with the state itself.
Absolutely. And I think this is an important issue because so often we deal with the issues in isolation in the United States, and not only do we deal with them in isolation, we deal with in the point of view of the individual killings, but from the point of view of, well, all that needs to happen is a tweak here, the police, or a tweak here, this tactic, or not that. And we don't understand the underlying reality, as you say, of what is the relationship between the majority of the black population, primarily the working and poor black population, and the police. And it's something, this antagonism is not really rooted in the tactics and even to a lesser extent the culture, but really the way we are situated in this capitalist imperialist society, America being the most prominent in the whole imperialist world system. And that, if you look at what's happening, the poverty, the deprivation in our communities, the 30 or 40 years of really planned disinvestment and degradation of our neighborhoods, of our communities. I mean, certainly, and I write about this at length in my book, Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. You see that as the economic crisis of the 70s hit, and there was a complete shift in the thinking of the imperialist ruling classes here in America, where essentially they pulled out of our neighborhoods and weren't going to provide jobs or social programs or decent education, and created a situation that, quite frankly, similar to many countries in the nations in the oppressed world, where a whole sort of gray and black market economy arose, where people were, sort of commonly known as hustling, where people are just trying to survive on an everyday basis, whether they're actions are, good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, that's just the reality of what they're doing. And all of these actions, a huge amount of these actions have been criminalized. I mean, you see Eric Garner, for instance, selling single cigarettes, being choked out to death for selling Newports on the street. But that's, something that happens all the time here in D.C. and elsewhere, and it's part of this broader black/gray market that exists. And so the antagonism is based and rooted in the basic contradiction inside of our communities that really the social existence of black people, by and large, in these oppressed communities is such that where their very existence, the things that they must, or their extended family or friends or whatever must do, either part-time or full-time to survive, become criminalized. It's really the criminalization of social existence outside of the system, even though you've been locked out of the system in so many ways. And we see that so much in D.C., how even when people go to work on construction sites and things like that, they're denied, they're pushed to the side, they're locked out of the system, and then anything else that they may do to survive is criminalized and puts them in an adversarial relationship with the police. So if we don't understand that antagonism is fundamental to capitalist imperialism and fundamentally linked not just to the war on drugs when we talk about the militarization of the police, but now fundamentally linked to this broader, and as the brother from London mentioned, this sort of broader international security intelligence culture that has built up this massive panopticon of knowledge of all of our movements and militarized police forces and militarized tactics and all of this, that I think is sort of further extending this criminalization of social existence to the extent it existed in oppressed communities onto a broader scale here at home and abroad.
As I'm listening to the conversation, I can't help but think that, these are conversations that are about 100, 200 years overdue, because the development of imperialism out of the United Kingdom is like one of the strongest imperial forces we've seen. If you read Lady Lugard's Tropical Dependence, you get a sense of the British Empire bragging about how much wealth they've stolen from all of their colonies, such that they have 10 million square miles of other people's property and land. And from that, they steal the wealth from each of those places. So the necessity of criminalizing each of the different people who are colonized as nations within their nation, and then ironically, when we go to the mother country, we are nations within that nation, we still don't get access to any of the realities of that colonial power. So whether it be in the UK or the US, the youngest colony of the UK, or in talking about Austria and Germany, wherever African people are, we are subject to the same colonial handbook that exists. And I see Tropical Dependence as one of those places written in the 1800s that we see these same kind of descriptions of people's wealth and responses to the people, so that the police forces, the militaries, the empire's defense forces are always aimed against us. What I'd like to do is now move to how we strike back against the empire, right? So, Sister Araba, how did Pamoja respond to each of the instances, and where is Pamoja now in terms of the kind of legacy that you see of continued struggle?
I mix what I like. So we had a standing question, right, for Sister Araba, and this question of what happens now, this reaction, this response you were talking about, Dr.
Sure. So what is the response to the police brutality from the Africans in Austria, the African Germans? Shout out to Sinfo. And how do these communities reassemble in the midst of this kind of police surveillance, repression, and crackdown on the African communities? And then where are the organizations now? And, we had this conversation off air, but the issue of organizations aren't necessarily institutionalized, right? So they are not institutions of the state itself. They are institutions of the community. And once communities get displaced and people are shot, people are killed, people are arrested, it may be much more difficult for those community organizations to maintain and sustain their efforts. So, Pamoja, for your perspective, Brother Eugene, and your perspective, the organizations that you're working with, and then Brother Kevin, you as well. So I'll start off with Sister Araba.
Okay, I have to add that I've been out of the country, out of Austria for 4 years, so I'm speaking from a perspective, from across the ocean, basically. So I would say that what happened in 1999 was, it was the biggest police raid in the Second Republic of Austria, and the target was actually black protest, our black protest. And this has to be taken into consideration that the percentage of black people in Austria is not very huge. So for such a small percentage to be targeted as the biggest police raid in the Second Republic of Austria really shows a dimension. And this attack was actually used to legitimize grand-style surveillance, right? So we were surveilled, and the impacts are still impacts that we're still battling with. There were so many levels involved that were very successful in various ways to silence protests, to silence our protests in various ways. That's what I see from my perspective. Of course, after that, protests did not die down, but I do believe it lost a lot of the radicality. The slogan we protested with was "Stop the racist police terror." That was the slogan. And now, from my perspective, from outside, I feel that we have diluted our demands, and that's what I mean with the co-optation. And that's also the question of how we actually see the status quo. What are we actually struggling for? And some of the demands go into the direction of purely inclusion. We need more police within the police, missing the point and also belittling the imperial dimension of the violence and the depth of our dehumanization that was already addressed previously. But one thing that I have come to realize, and that as Pamoja has become also an issue, is also to go back and, as Kwame Nkrumah said, positive action starts with the analysis of the present situation. And one thing that we also are struggling to understand is the space that we're actually struggling from. And in Austria, we are in a post-Nazistic state that is at the same time also neo-colonial. So what is the continuation within that space, right? So this is part of the strategies, and of course the international dimension. I think previously I would say self-critically as part of the organizer during the 1990s that we were too much stuck on the local level. We are such a small minority that we were busy to scream that we are here and there is black people in Austria. And I think it is something that fragments the struggle. It fragments the understanding of the violence that we actually deal with if we do not connect it to a world system, and if we do not connect the police brutality in the diaspora with the neo-colonial dehumanizing realities on the continent of Africa that basically are connected to the mass grave that I was speaking on before. So I think it's really a very big strategy is really seeing the connections and not allowing a fragmentation of our struggle, because the divide and rule strategy is something that I feel has been much too successful throughout history. So I would say there is still trauma of what has been happening, but I also see that this local approach, connecting the local with the global, is the only way forward, basically.
Araba, can I go back a little bit? I hear a British accent in your voice. You're Austrian. How did you get to Austria?
It's basically my father who's he studied in Bulgaria, and then he had to leave Bulgaria in the 60s and come to Austria. So it wasn't usually in the 60s when African students came to Austria, it wasn't the primary place to be, because the places to be would have been like London or Paris. So he basically ended up in Austria, and I ended up being born in Austria. And
is he of African descent?
Yes, he's from Ghana.
Oh, okay.
So my British accent is just connected to me studying in London, and my name Johnston-Arthur is also very British because of the colonial history and the ethnicity. The Fantis are the most colonized people basically in Ghana. That's why my name is very British.
I mix what I like. Dr. Burroughs, you wanted to move on with the conversation. You had a question for one of our guests on the phone?
I did. I wanted to ask something of Kevin and of our guests here in the studio. I wanted to ask about the problems of a Pan-African identity when you are essentially an immigrant or the son or daughter of an immigrant from another country, understanding that you have your culture, your history, etc. How hard is it to unite as an African people when you have your own individual cultural identity, Caribbean, etc.?
That's an excellent question, and a question which I'm always keen to answer in the African, because of course identity, it's both historical but it's also an ongoing social construct, and I choose, and many of us in the UK, we choose to foreground our African identity. When I was a child, the Caribbean community were called the West Indian community. Then we were called the Afro-Caribbean community. Now we're called the African Caribbean community. I choose to simply refer to myself as an African, and if asked to explain why that is, if I need to explain my African humanity, I do so as I did at the beginning of this program when I introduced myself and say I'm an African, the son of Africans from the Americas. In many respects, I am also an African American, given the nature of colonial enslavement, and my forefathers were taken to the Americas, to the islands in the Caribbean, and enslaved for the profit of global white supremacy, capitalist white supremacy. In terms of how we deal with our identity here in the UK, well, you know, it's partly a question of numbers. As the sister explained in Austria, when you have a smaller community, we are the largest community of Africans in Europe, but still we're not as large as the United States. But it is a question of numbers, but it's also a question of identifying yourself as other than that which the local powers that be wish to identify you as. So really that means positively asserting an African identity and seeking to engage with organizing beyond being simply members of a black community, because there is a danger that you become just black British or black French or black Austrian or whatever. And whereas one understands the use of the terminology black in those instances, that is insufficient to describe our diaspora position and our diaspora heritage. So it's the same as the States. There are other issues, or Brazil, or other parts of the diaspora. There are other issues which impinge upon the assertion of a positive African identity, and the desire of society to co-opt members of the colonized, the internally colonized, away from self-organization and self-expression and self-affirmation towards ways of being which are consistent with the maintenance of our oppression. Does that
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And by the way, I just wanted to say, for those paying attention to the mainstream and Oprah Winfrey style conversations, this is so nicely in a non-Raven Simone kind of conversation right now.
Can I just add as well? Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's so like emancipation. Emancipation is nothing if it's not emancipation of voice. And to the extent that, you know, you're on the radio show that we're on now, you're having a promotional drive to keep going. It's essential that we have these various platforms where we, as Africans, wherever we are in the diaspora, center ourselves. You asked earlier, Dr. Jared, well, how are we undertaking the struggle from our different perspectives? Well, in the UK, one of the organisations I've been involved with is an organisation called the National African People's Parliament. There are other organisations which go out there teaching and educating in a movement basis, in a movement form, our people how to be lawyers for themselves. I take the view that being a lawyer, you needn't necessarily act as some kind of priest or a part of a priesthood separate from the community from which you come. You know, we ought not to be lawyers trying to maintain the status quo, but working as movement lawyers, movements which are engaged in an anti-systemic way of moving beyond, trying to create an imagination, an African imagination beyond the confines of the societies in which we live in present. So it's a constant dialogue with myself, a constant dialogue with my brothers and sisters, and a constant affirmation of our African possibilities beyond the limits which are imposed upon us by the education system and other hegemonic media impositions upon our African identity.
Araba, what's your view in terms of from Austria?
I would completely agree, and I want to pick up on what was just said about the being a question of numbers, and the African diaspora in Austria being very small in numbers has also forced us to a more Pan-African position, and it also ties back to the question of police brutality. If we look at police brutality and oppression by the state, Africans, black people are very much seen as homogeneous, right? So you can't really afford to stick to your national identity because it doesn't really matter for the police. If you're Nigerian or if you're from Gambia, you're a black person. You can even be African American. Before you show your passport, it might be too late. So I think it's not necessarily the advancement of our Pan-African consciousness, but just the necessity of the space in which we're living, which has very much forced us. And I can also very much relate to this whole process of decolonization, because there has been long struggles to be accepted as Afro-Germans or Afro-Austrians, and this has also shown our limitations to be dreaming of being included in a national space, because it seemed to be impossible to be black and German or black in Austria or black in Swiss and Polish and so on. But it is dangerous because it leaves you in this trap of inclusion, the dream of inclusion, and doesn't allow you a systemic critique that connects the struggle to a struggle that is global and connects people in the African diaspora. So Pamoja, for example, fought very hard to be allowed to be called African, like our name is Movement of the African Diaspora in Austria. And we actually, the way it works with organizations, you have to file in by the police. And it was a back and forth whether an African diaspora exists in Austria. And for us, it was important because it shows this connected identity in a bigger scope. So I think a lot of this Pan-African consciousness has been created by the reality of police brutality that has confronted us with the reality that a black person is just a black person, and that has been reflected in the protests as well.
Araba, to me, you raised some very important points that might be closer to home than Eastern Europe or Europe. Is that no matter if you're black, it doesn't matter to those people who are looking at you and trying to police you. It doesn't matter the socioeconomic origin of your family. If you're out on the street, you're still black. You know, they don't know that your father's a doctor or a lawyer or a judge even. They don't know if he washes windows. They just know that you're black.
And as you let us know, even Will Smith can get pulled over.
That's right.
You know, I think this question of identity is very important, and I wanted Eugene to talk about this because, Eugene, my opinion of what's been going on since Obama's election is, you know, we used to be black people. Then we became black Americans, and then we became African Americans. And it seems like in the 6th year of the Obama administration, we've now become Americans. And it
when
seems
did
like
that happen?
It happened when President Obama got elected and started hanging out with Jay-Z and Beyonce and becoming a power couple, and then all these black people getting on reality shows. So it seems like we have an identity problem.
And then
as well.
Raven Simone said, "We're just American. I'm just American.
It's
I'm not
real
African American."
So Eugene, I'd like you to address our identity crisis, if you may. Eugene?
Eugene, are you there? You should be.
Oh, I'm sorry. My phone was actually on mute. I use Howard Homecoming, and I'm close to a window, so it's loud outside. But you know, I think it's a great question, and you know, really, it's almost unbelievable. I mean, it's so funny because I think that's when did this actually happen. But the reality is, and I think honestly, we can tie this identity crisis directly to what has happened in Ferguson and what happened before that actually in Brooklyn with an uprising after the killing of Kamani Gray, where the masses of black people are attempting to reinsert themselves and reinsert their experience into the conversation of body politics because it has been written out by those who have reached a level of success. And so I think what has happened is that in the wake of the civil rights movement and really the lack of progress in so many fronts, so much of our hope, our achievements, our views of pride in black people became tied to the concept of black first. And as we've got an increasing number of black first, that's become the definition of success for an entire community, entire people.
I mix what I like.
And we're back on WPFW 89.3 FM. And we have Eugene Puryear on a better line this time. So he was in the middle of answering my question about identity. And he was talking about the American version of that. And Eugene, please pick up where we left off.
Absolutely. And I think where I left off was just this focus that we've had on black first, because of really the lack of substantive progress on every other front, meant that to a degree that not only did the success of these black first come to define to non-black people in America the state of blackness, I guess, and what it meant to have success in blackness, but as these people ascended to these roles, they became increasingly called upon by the same white power structure to mediate the racial conversations. I was thinking about this the other day. I had just had a random moment where I was like, I wonder what would have happened to Steve Stout. As you all know, was big in the hip-hop world, and so I did some research, and I found out that the brother had graduated from misrepresenting us in hip-hop to owning and operating a whole advertising apparatus that was aimed at all for him, was employed by all these Fortune 500 companies who were looking for ways to have more quote-unquote ethnically inclusive advertising and so on and so forth, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, all of that. And so to so much of a degree, not only for non-black people do these markers then become the self-definition and these individuals become the self-declared spokespeople, but even for us as black people, to the extent that we are victimized by this cultural apparatus that we do not control in any way, shape, or form, we start to self-define based on the marks of what has been put out there as quote-unquote black success, both by non-black people and the few that they have called on to mediate the discussion. And I think that's so much of what the iMiXWHATiLiKE, the concept that Jared, you've brought out and brought to many of us, speaks to our lack of control over these cultural spaces, and the fact that these black firsts, which we focused so heavily on in the 70s and the 80s as signs of progress, almost became sort of the harbinger of our demise, as those individuals, very small of them, were elevated to the mediators of all racial discussions, and their experience became the lens through which all other experiences were navigated. And I think that's created almost a schizophrenia, whereby we have a black president, we have Jay-Z, we have, commercials and all these different things that seem to be signs of black progress. Yet still, when we look around in our everyday life, it seems as if that's not the case. And it's created, I think, an identity crisis is the perfect time of saying it, because we lack that control to self-define, and the only...
Brother Eugene, Brother Eugene, I think it is something about your proximity to Howard's homecoming, that centrifugal force of celebrating black middle classness and your anti-black middle classness is just clashing somewhere on the antennas, and the airwaves are distorting the words that you're actually saying. So each time you go into further depth into what you're saying, that Howard homecoming force is just sending out an anti-whirlwind of we will not see you in this whirlwind, nor will you hear us in this whirlwind. I don't know what's happening, but we wish you were here in the studio live with us so that Howard homecoming field of taking you from Kansas into the Wizard of Oz would not get you swept up and lost on the radio. We keep losing your sound. Brother Kevin, are you still with us?
I'm still with you. Yep.
Okay. Good. Now, what is happening in terms of documenting the imperial nature of the police? Like within these confines, we have, numbers of lynchings and numbers of black folks being shot. How do you keep track of that within that imperial place? Please give the Queen my worst if you can. Tell the prince and his family I want my jewels back.
Oh, please.
And tell all of them folks the Moors had the castles first. And I don't like Downton Abbey. Tell them all of that, please.
Well, I'll make sure the message gets through, Brother Jared. I assure you.
This is hate. This is hate.
As you probably have guessed.
Okay, go ahead though. Go ahead. My fault. Go ahead.
I mean, black people, black males in London, in the metropolitan area of London, we are 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched. You call it stop and frisk. We call it stop and search. We are 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white males in London. In other parts of the country, we are 26 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white males in London. Statistically, since 1969, there have been over 2,000 deaths in custody or extrajudicial killings, when you include deaths in prisons, by the hands of the police, by the hands of the border agencies, by the hands of agents of the state, of black and minority ethnic communities in the UK since the late 1960s, and there's yet to be one successful conviction for that. So we have no official statistical organization which gathers together this information. We do have an organization called the Institute of Race Relations in the UK, which puts together or seeks to put together some kind of a statistical analysis and reference points so that we can gauge and have a meaningful discourse based on numbers. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Yeah. But one of the issues which we have to deal with in Europe is that, unlike in the UK and the US, unlike those two, for want of a better word, Anglo-Saxon nations, on the European continent, most of those jurisdictions legally it is unlawful to have statistics based on race and ethnicity. So if you go to France, for example, Portugal, I have comrades, brothers and sisters in organizations in France. There's an organization called Parti des Indigènes, which is the party of the indigenous, where those of us who are colonized have taken the word indigenous and inverted it so that we claim our full rights, our full human rights. In France and in Portugal and in Spain and elsewhere, they don't keep statistics. So you cannot as easily identify who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets deported based on race and ethnicity, and it's a problem.
This is all very interesting. In fact, go ahead, gentlemen.
So we had, thank you very much, Brother Kevin, for helping us with the stats there.
Yeah.
I think we still got Eugene with us, and we want to make sure that his line is good. But in the meantime, we have a sizable new pledge.
Wow.
From Paula Gaskins.
Paula Gaskins.
DST.
Oh, and she's representing Delta Sigma Theta.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'm not a soror, but I'm certainly a sister.
All right, and she shared some words here. You want to read that off right there?
Yeah, what?
So she says she's calling for a sustaining membership pledge from the sorors, the Sisters of Delta Sigma Theta.
Oh, my.
Challenge.
That is for the entire sorority. She said, put 100 years worth of pledges up on the station right now.
Oh, my.
Did she say, am I just reading that wrong? Forgive me.
Oh, my.
You know, I come out of that U.S. school system. I didn't get that good education like Brother Kevin with the Brits right there.
I mix what I like.
You are live with the guests of the Queen Andrea Bray Show, the Killer Bees, Dr. Burroughs, Dr. Ball, Dr. Haight in the building. We got Tiffany coming down from the stairs, and she wants to help with pitching and pledging, so please show your support for the show at 202-588-9739. Again, that's 202-588-9739, or you can hit us from the 1-800 number. That is
1-800-222-9739.
9739. That's not hard to remember, but If it was, what would you say?
I'd say 1-800
222
9739.
9739. Perfect. So, what you are pledging is the intergenerational transmission of resistance. This is an important day. We have been talking about Ferguson and Beyond, the idea of police brutality and the police themselves and their relationship with the black community, not just within the confines of the United States, but in the other colonial empires, from Austria to the UK to those folks who've controlled South Africa. We're going to hear from people from Trinidad and Tobago later on today, and we're going to keep this conversation going. We're here with Sister Araba, and she has been talking about some of the work out of the Africans in the European Union and the disunion of African people there. And we want to talk about, if you can remember, that just recently there was a conference on Afrophobia, a convening of the European Union to hold a convention on Afrophobia in Europe. Do you have any thoughts on that convening of that situation?
It's quite some time ago, but as far as I remember, the positions held by the participants from within the African diaspora was basically to struggle for the acceptance and acknowledgement of a phenomenon of Afrophobia, which would be a perfect concept to dilute and belittle the depths of violence, the depths of imperial violence that African people are confronted with. So if it's a phobia, then we're talking about a psychological fear, and the solution would be to break the fear. But it doesn't. I think it's a concept that really enables to make the visible, to invisibilize the structures of exploitation and their neocolonial legacy, especially if it comes to the continent of Europe, and how this still defines the relationship to African people within the continent, and within the continent of Europe, but also on the continent of Africa. So this also ties to some of the different political approaches, and I think like coming back to the question of the imperial design of policing, I think it really comes back to how we actually define racism, right? And this is one of the examples that shies away from the structures, from the systemic realities of racism, from the exploitive world system of racism, and racism basically being synonymous with neocolonialism. So I think this is an example that goes in that direction.
Okay, good. And it's interesting that you're talking about the psychological fear aspect and that not being adequate to describe it, because we were just listening to Inner City Blues by Marvin Gaye, and a classic track that kind of expresses the I think as Sister Queen Andrea described, the sign of the times, right? So that when he says that there are trigger-happy policemen, he's not just talking about policemen who are in fear, who just shooting blindly. There's something about that trigger makes them happy, like a room without a roof type happy. And they just shooting up in the air at the black folks, right? So when we talk about this conversation, we're really talking about police who are engaging in violence because of the necessity of anti-black perspectives that engages people in violence. And African folk have to understand that very clearly, that this is not just a discussion about why people do not like us, so that if we could get them to like us, they would stop committing violence. There is a necessity for the state to have this relationship with communities of African people. And we've discussed that from the UK to Austria, here in the US, and we're trying to internationalize that conversation, because without an international theft of African people called enslavement and the trade, there would be no discussion about an international reality for African people within this Western confine. So we want to bring Queen Andrea Bray back in.
Yes, sir.
And what is your goal with the show, the Andrea Bray Show? What are you accomplishing on a week-to-week basis with this show?
I like to think that I'm here to help celebrate life, especially life over 30. That means 30, 40, 50, all the way up to where my aunt is, 105. This reflects the music of our lives. We have all had very difficult times in our lifetime, whether it's 45 or 35 or 65. But there are also some joyous times. And the music kind of resurrects those spirits of yesterday. It is the music of our lives. It reminds us that we're not young now, but we were. Your kids think you were born this age. But you had to go through what they're going through now, but they don't believe it. They think you don't know anything. But WPFW allows us to remind ourselves that we do have a life. We did have a life, and that is the life we live now. And so we celebrate and salute all the wonderful people who listen religiously to WPFW, and especially to the Andrea Bray Show. I hope we bring joy. I hope we bring happiness. And reminisce is not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
And so when we were talking off air, we were also talking about this idea of the ghettos that the black people are from and the inner city blues they face in those ghettos. And Dr. Burroughs was talking about his Newark experiences, and you were sharing that you were from Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And that you recognized where you were as it occurred during the riots.
Well, to me, where we lived was a neighborhood. It was my neighborhood. I was very proud of it. I knew the good parts of it, the bad parts of it. And then when the riots came, I found out that it was a ghetto.
Now,
that was a shock.
Now, what were those riots at the time?
The civil disobedience of 1968.
And what are your recollections on that? Because
it was horrible.
I hear the stories about D.C. and that the National Guard was called to form a line where people who were protesting and rioting or rebelling, as we like to call it, couldn't cross 16th Street. So you couldn't get into Northwest past 16th Street. You could rebel everywhere else, but you would not get past that National Guard. What kind of things did you see in 68? Was the National Guard brought in?
Oh, yes. I think it was just horrible in most major cities in this country. And I don't think it was civil disobedience. I think it was absolute frustration that led to civil disobedience. You feel kind of helpless when one of your esteemed leaders is shot down, dead. And it was just a shock. It was just a profound shock.
Now, what's interesting, right, as a hateologist, I study psychology, so we go from, in talking about grief, we go from this period of being in shock to denial, and then anger mixes in. But it sounds like you're saying that there was a mix of shock and anger at the same time, and that with that anger came a response to give the state what they had been giving the people, which is to say that if you are going to commit violence against us, even the King of Love, as Nina Simone was describing him earlier, and said, they took the King of Love. I ain't got no more love. Right? That's why we call ourselves Dr. Hate. Mm-hmm. You keep killing love, somebody gonna rise up and start hating, right? But in that midst, you were witnessing this as somebody who wasn't thinking about the conditions of the society. So what were the kinds of things that you saw happening to the actual property of downtown Pittsburgh, if there's a downtown Pittsburgh?
There is an absolute lovely downtown Pittsburgh. It was then, and it's even better now. But interestingly enough, you can really see the disparity, because downtown Pittsburgh, which wasn't as touched as the local downtown areas, it was rebuilt immediately. They're still rebuilding those communities that were predominantly black, even though most of the people who lived and worked there and worked in the businesses didn't own the property, nor did they own the businesses. But that is what we knew. There was nothing strange about it. That's what it was.
Okay. And I think, Dr. Burroughs, you have similar stories out of Newark, where, going to school at Seton Hall University right outside of Newark, you would see in your drive from, Penn Station in downtown Newark all the way up, you would see the quote-unquote projects that have been destroyed by the rebellions still existing in the same state, much like people are saying when you go to New Orleans. You still see parts of New Orleans that are in the same condition, the same horrible conditions that were created by the breaching of the levees and then not allowing people to return to their homes. And restore their homes. So what did you see in Newark in that same time period, and that it still exists now?
Well, I was born just a few months after the rebellions of 1967, which happened because of an issue of police brutality. A black man by the name of John Smith was stopped by police, beaten by police, and the community, which had already been upset because they literally displaced an entire black neighborhood in the Central Ward for the building of a university hospital, which used to be the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. Now it's the Rutgers University Medical School. So the community was already upset over that. They were upset over the fact that they could not engage in City Hall. City Hall was literally controlled by the mafia. This is not figuratively. This is not Sopranos, HBO. This is real. The mafia controlled the city and kept the black community contained. So when John Smith happened, there were rebellions through the central part of the city and up through certain parts of the city. And even today, in 2014, there are parts of the city that has never recovered from that. And so going to school at Seton Hall University, I would take the bus up, and you can literally see the blocks change as Newark becomes South Orange. You can literally see grass and greenery and police, presence, and signs in the parks in South Orange saying for South Orange residents only, which we got what that meant. And so these things happened across the country, and particularly in 1967, when there were over 100 cities that went aflame, and of course in 1968 with Martin Luther King's assassination, because Newark rebelled again in 1968, and the city is still not recovered.
Absolutely. Well, it's 6 o'clock right now on WPFW 89.3 FM Washington. Well, we're your capital city radio station. We're in discussions today about a number of topics, but we're primarily concerned about what's going on nationally and internationally, especially when it pertains to police brutality. I don't want it to be so negative, but let's just call it policing. But what you were saying is true. There are parts of many major cities, like Gary, Indiana. It's still a mess. It's still a mess. That's part of the problem with Detroit. It's still a mess since 1968, but just certain sections. I don't know why people think that we would be oblivious to that. We're just now seeing more reconstruction in Washington, D.C., and I wasn't even here for the riots, but I understand it was some kind of riot. So there you go, civil disobedience.
Insurrections.
Oh, insurrection, is that what you call it?
I mix what I like, I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Live healthy. I mix what I like,